Well, I have to say it's a complete treat to have Doug Lemov here talking to me. Doug needs no introduction, but let's do one anyway. If there's a world famous megastar within the education world, it is Doug, the author of Teach Like a Champion, which has changed the lives of many teachers, and Reading Reconsidered, and the Remote Teaching Guide, which has been so invaluable to so many of us in recent months. And also, you're one of the managing directors for the Uncommon Schools Network. That's correct, isn't it, Doug?
That's right. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, so there's lots of things that I'd like to talk to you about this afternoon, but maybe we could start a little. And I've heard you tell this story before about about the genesis of Teach Like a Champion, where the idea came from, and how you built it into the program, which continues evolving. And I believe version 3.0 is nearly upon us.
It comes out in July, I'm happy to say. And as always, it will feature lots and lots of videos of fantastic teachers doing what they do, which is, I think that's my favorite part of it, is just getting to honor teachers for their incredible work. Teachers are the teachers are such amazing problem solvers, and nothing could have convinced us more than watching them suddenly be asked to go online and figure it all out and still do brilliant things. With very little advanced preparation and asked to do a brand new task. And so, but Teach Like a Champion sort of derives from identifying teachers who make an incredible difference, particularly among students of who aren't born to privilege, and studying what they do and trying to put names on it and identify by giving names to things, sort of conjure them into being so that teachers can talk about them, and showing them lots of videos so they can study colleagues in action and steal little things that they like. And so it's been a pleasure to be a part of, to get to do that for a living. And it sort of started by accident. We started Uncommon Schools almost 20 years ago now, and we hired motivated, driven people who wanted to do great things for young people who weren't who came from parts of our country where they didn't have great schools and they didn't have great classrooms. And at first, many of those teachers came back to us and they said, this is so hard and there's so many challenges and I don't know what to do when, fill in the blank. You could imagine 56 things that you could fill in the blank with. And it just felt like there weren't answers to those questions. And so the process started with me just trying to find positive outlier teachers who had been incredibly successful and observe what they did. And the first couple of times I went to visit these classrooms with incredible results, I couldn't believe. I felt the thing that you feel when you're in the classroom of the teacher who most sets your heart, ablaze with just skill and excellence. And so then I thought, well, I'm going to have to. No one will believe this, so I have to bring a video camera with me, and started to tape what they did and try and make game film out of it. And so that's where it started, was just trying to help teachers be successful. If you're going to work really, really hard at the task of teaching, and teaching is really, really difficult work, you deserve to be successful and you deserve to have tools that can help you be successful.
Okay, so Doug, let me ask you a little bit about Uncommon Schools. You said it started around about 20 years ago, and people in the UK might not be completely familiar with charter schools and how they operate.
Sure.
Although I think often the parallel is drawn between free schools in England. Is there a difference?
Well, so charter schools they're public schools, but they're autonomous, so they operate outside of the sort of district infrastructure that we have here. The way that schools operate is much more decentralized in the U.S., and so the federal government has actually very little to do with public education. It's mostly run by the states, and they delegate decision-making authority to districts, and they tend to be fairly bureaucratic and not especially flexible. And so the idea behind charter schools was we'll give schools building level autonomy and hold them accountable for their results and see what they can do. And so they tend to be much more flexible and more autonomous. Interestingly, they run the gamut in philosophical styles and approaches. I think Among the most successful have been a group of schools like Uncommon Schools and KIPP and Achievement First that run in kind of a similar way, but you can find almost anything under the sun. As a charter school, really, it's just an operating philosophy.
Right. And I think one of the things that sort of fascinates me about how charter schools run in some cities is that they actually occupy the same buildings as public schools. How does that work?
Yeah, that tends to happen a lot in New York City. And I mean, so I think it's a market-based reform charter school. So the idea is in the United States, money goes to the district, the school district. So let's say there's Centerville City School District. They get a pot of money from the state to educate all the students in the district. When there's a charter school in the district, the money that would go to educate those students follows the students to the school. And so the district would forward a per pupil portion of the revenue to the school. The school gets to operate. And the idea is that puts pressure on the district to be better also, to keep their students. One of the challenges is that that per pupil revenue does not take into account real estate costs and building costs. So it's the operating revenue that's divided up when per pupil revenues are allocated. And so that's actually about 70% of what schools actually spend on to educate students, because they also buy and own buildings. And so in different places, there have been different efforts to sort of mitigate that issue. In New York City, the city decided that district schools with extra space had to lease back extra space, or could lease back extra space to charter schools, so that they couldn't just sort of sit on empty buildings while charter schools were out there trying to lease incredibly expensive space in New York City. And so you often find there would be schools with with half the building unused, and so they have the result has been that those schools lease half of their space to charter schools. So oftentimes there's a district school and a charter school in the same building. And hopefully, in the best case, schools often find a way to work together and be collegial and positive and share ideas. And I think there are also some cases where it's where the relations are not quite so positive. But for the most part, educators tend to get down to the business of educating kids pretty quickly and get beyond the tensions and conflicts relatively quickly.
Yeah. It's interesting that I hadn't realised until this summer. I read a book by Thomas Sowell called Charter Schools and Their Enemies. I was quite surprised at the level of controversy there is that surrounds charter school education. Is that something that you think your network comes up against much?
Yes, quite a bit.
Because he was particularly talking about some of the controversy around Achievement First, who's got quite a robust and confrontational leader in Markowitz, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's actually Success Academies.
Success Academy. Sorry, yeah.
Yes. Look, I think she runs great schools, and Eva Moskowitz, and her results have been incredible. And I think she's not afraid. She's not afraid to speak what she thinks is the truth, and there have been conflicts for her, and I think she would say that every battle she fights is to make sure she can run the schools she can for kids. And so I think many of us would tend to take for better or for worse, would probably take a more conciliatory approach and try to, I think there's rational dissent and there's irrational dissent. And I think people who have legitimate questions and want to make sure that it's done right, those are good questions. And then I think there are people who are always going to fight what charter schools do. And to me, they're deeply important for empowering parents. Parents should have the right to choose the schools that they send their children to, especially if they don't have those choices, they're consigned to schools that are fundamentally inadequate and don't give their children what they deserve. And so, yes, there are tensions, and there are positive tensions and there are negative tensions. And for the most part, I think most of us just get on with the work of educating students and tend to ignore the shouting as much as we can.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so the work that you do at Uncommon, obviously you has turned into you being a national figure. I think it would be fair to say international figure in the world of education. And the Teach Like a Champion book has received obviously huge praise from teachers across the world, but it's also received its share of criticism. And there seems to be this argument that that it's aimed at children from disadvantaged backgrounds, children from particularly from ethnic minorities, and there seems to be, in some people's minds, I think the argument sometimes seems to go along the lines of, why should children from those disadvantaged backgrounds, why should they have stricter expectations for behaviour? Why should they be treated in different ways from middle class kids, from white kids in different neighbourhoods? And I think one of the questions I wanted to put to you is that, do you think the sort of education that a network like Uncommon offers is appropriate for all children? Should all children get that kind of experience, in your view?
I think everyone should have the right to it.
Yeah.
People ask me all the time, would you want your own children, educated in the Teach Like a Champion way? And the answer is yes, emphatically. And not only that, but I've worked with the schools that my children go to try and give them what I perceive to be a more engaging, more rigorous, more demanding school experience that is worthy of the children that they are. And I think that every parent has the right to ask for that for their children. I don't perceive Teach Like a Champion to be a book about. I think it applies to schools and classrooms. To me, the most interesting application is like the place of the greatest need is what happens to students who are in areas where schools are insufficient to serve them, and who often bear the legacy of having been for years in schools that have served them poorly. And I'm sorry, but in that case, there is some urgency involved. There is no time to waste, because students are years behind, and if they want to have the chance to achieve their dreams and participate in meritocracy and opportunity, schools are going to have to do better, and they're going to have to catch them up, and they're going to have to, they're going to have to gain several, they're going to have to catch up in reading and math and science, and there's a lot of work to be done. So I think, to me, children have the right to that, and I think that it can be done lovingly and supportively. And my kids are older now. My daughter is in her last year before she goes to university, and if you want to make her angry, waste her time in class. Honestly, yeah. The teachers that she has who have high expectations for her, who push her hard, who pay attention to what she's doing every minute in class, and who give her hard and challenging work, and don't waste a second, she loves those teachers. And the teachers who waste her time, she's like, why am I sitting here when we're doing an empty task, or when we're wasting 15 minutes of my time? That frustrates her. And I love that about her. I love the fact that she wants excellence every time she walks in the classroom. I think most students are that way, whether they realize it or not. When they've had excellence, they respond to it and they believe in it because they know that it's a form of honoring them and their capacity. So I don't know. So yes, I think it's about good teaching, and I think that teachers always. It's a set of tools that are about good teaching, and great teachers always take tools and adapt them to the situation that they're in. But I think students deserve it.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, one of the things that it occurs to me is that for children who from advantaged backgrounds, it almost doesn't matter that much what goes on in schools, because they'll be caught by their families, by their wider networks. But for children that don't have those assets, school might be certainly their best hope at having choice. And if schools aren't doing that, then they're really letting them down.
I think that's perfectly put. Better put than I put it, but absolutely true. There's a significant number of schools in this country that no parent would willingly send their child to, and children, and real kids and real families are forced to consign their children to those schools every day, and it is fundamentally unjust, and it is fundamentally unfair, and that makes me angry.
Yeah, no, and I think that one of the things that I think sometimes people haven't thought through necessarily is that if you're wealthy, you've always got choice. You choose to move house to a district where has a school you want your children to attend, or maybe you can choose to pay for your children's education. But if you don't have money, you don't have those choices. And so if there is just a default, you have to go to this school, no matter how dysfunctional it is, and only poor people are faced with that lack of choice, then there's something really inequitous about it, isn't there?
I mean, that's one of the biggest dissents against charter schools, which is people who have the luxury of place and the luxury of caste say we don't really need school choice, do we? Schools work fine the way they are. And that's because they've already exercised school choice. They've moved to a place where they have excellent school options. No one who has choice does not use it. Everyone would put their child into the best school that they possibly could. The question is who gets choice, and is it fair that that it's something given to families of prosperity, and that the rest of families have to take what's given to them, even when it's inadequate. So I guarantee you that anyone who says choice is unnecessary has choice.
Right, fair point. Okay, we can certainly put that to the test. If anyone feels that they don't have, that choice is unnecessary and feels that they don't have choice, to get in touch, and we'll happily discuss that with you.
They've moved to a place where the square foot real estate cost to live there is 5x what it is 2 miles away, and only they can afford to live there. And the question is, do the people who can't afford to live in the leafy suburbs also get good schools?
Yeah, no, exactly. So one of the pieces. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I was also just going to say, I think parent choice. Parent choice is really profoundly important, and just because a parent is not wealthy does not mean they are not capable of choosing a great school for parents who don't have economic means are no less capable of choosing a great school for their children than wealthy parents are. But I just think there's a lot of patronizing out there about somehow wealthy upper middle class people know what's good for kids who aren't born to privilege better than their own parents. I just I doubt that very much.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and I think that certainly, that happens here in the UK as well. That typically teachers tend to be from more middle class backgrounds, from more affluent backgrounds. Not always, but by dint of becoming a teacher, arguably that's something that's happened in your life anyway, and that then we sit around making judgments about parents from less affluent backgrounds about how they don't seem to know how to bring up their kids and all this sort of stuff. And there's something that always strikes me as horribly parochial about that. There's, as I say, patronizing, that parents are doing the best they can, and sometimes they do need support, and sometimes maybe we need to get better at working with parents to give them the support that they need. But to assume that they don't want the best for their children where does that come from? So it's a really good point.
It's a stunningly undemocratic idea for people who claim that schools are a profoundly democratic institution. I mean, clearly there are parents who struggle to parent and who have addiction issues and everything else, and that happens everywhere. But I would also say that 99 out of the 100 best parents that I have met in my life are parents who do an incredible job of raising their children to be outstanding people, and to not just in a school sense, but in a character and an integrity sense. And they do it without means, and they do it despite not having economic resources. I actually, the quality, there are so many breathtakingly excellent parents raising their kids without resources who are we have not only should we not be judging them, like we have so much to learn from those parents in many cases, and they don't, they aren't given voices. We're often very dismissive of them in a very patronizing way, like they can't be trusted to choose for their own children. But I've just met a lot of those parents and have incredible admiration for them, not only because of the challenges they put up with, but because of how wise and insightful they are about their own children.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. So you mentioned there about parenting, sort of producing people of character and integrity. How important are those things in the school curriculum? Are those things that we should be explicitly trying to teach or to mold, or should we just be focusing on academics?
I think there can be different answers to this question. I personally believe strongly in character and believe strongly in, if I was going to choose, when I choose a school for my children, I would choose a place that makes them into the best people, that helps reinforce my values and helps make them into the best people that they can be. And I grieve for parents who send their children to schools that undercut their values and socialize their children in dangerous ways. Parents who have values have a right to have institutions that support those values, and at a minimum don't undercut them. But I think that's just another part of the story of what happens when you don't have school choice. So I think I personally choose character and values as a critical part of education. I recognize that not everybody does, or not everybody thinks that they do, and that's, I think, just another argument for school choice, which is academic excellence is one thing that parents can choose for, but also, culture and philosophy, those are equally important. I know so many parents who are forced to send their kids to schools that undercut the things that they believe in, their values of right and wrong. It's just not right to have a parent have to do.
No, and you really recognize, don't you, as your children get older, just how vulnerable you are as a parent to your students becoming influenced by their peer groups and the wider community, and that you're not, you no longer are as powerful and as influential as you might hope to have been.
Times 100 in the era of the smartphone. Yeah. Right, when culture is invisible to you and it's constantly acting on your it used to be that you could, at least when your children got home, you could insulate them to some degree, and you had some knowledge and control over who they were socializing with, and you could shape those things. But society has engineered it to make it incredibly hard to express and reinforce the things that you believe as a family consistently with your children. And so you send them to institutions where you have little control, and then they come, I think the research is pretty clear that, your child's peers influence their behavior as they get older more than you do as an adult.
Yeah.
And that's scary and challenging.
It sure is. And you mentioned there about that hidden culture of the mobile phone. I remember reading a review from you a couple of years ago for Marilyn Wolfe's book Reader Come Home, and and I've read that book as well. It seemed to have a really profound effect on you. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was really shaken by reading that book. It made me realize several things. I mean, first of all, it's a beautiful and technical study into how the brain makes meaning when we're reading. And I think one of her key points is it's not just that students read less; it's that they read differently. That your brain is not wired to read; that it learns to read by repurposing different parts of your cortex that were developed for other purposes, and that how you read influences the way that neuroplasticity wires you to read, and that students increasingly read, instead of reading in states of sustained focus and concentration, where you and I, growing up in an era without cell phones, would read a book for an hour and in sort of deep meditative focus and sustained concentration. Students now read in states where they're constantly disrupted and distracted. And because we're used to reading on screens, we're addicted to novelty bias, which is like new information coming in at any moment. And so I'm sure you feel this yourself, David.
Yeah.
You're reading a text now and you can feel your eyes racing down the page ahead of yourself, waiting for, the next stimulus. And Marianne Wolf has this great phrase in the book, skimming is the new normal. And so I think without our realizing it, we're profoundly changing our relationship to text and to reading, and I feel real sadness about this, to say that, the book is dying. It's in a death struggle against the cell phone, and I think that, interestingly, schools are perhaps the only institution that can fight back. It's the one place where we could have cohesive, intentional policies to restrict the access of technology temporarily, to say for 1 hour there are going to be no phones and it's going to be pencil to paper and you in a book, and you're going to learn to sustain attention and concentration in the way that previous generations have. But I think, unfortunately, more schools are enamored with technology, and they're looking to sell parents on how embedded, and integrated technology is in everything that they do. And I would just say, as a parent, I'm more interested in the way that technology is restricted than the way that technology is embedded in everything my children are going to do in school. I yearn for them with, an hour an hour's unrestricted time with a book, sustained and focused without their cell phones in their pocket. But most schools aren't really even able to restrict access to cell phones in the classrooms. I know that, in my own children's school, kids have their phones out straight through lessons.
Right. I mean, that's something that I think the tide has turned somewhat on that here in England, that more and more schools are making that decision to restrict students' phone usage during the school day.
It's an incredibly hard decision.
Yeah.
Students will push back. Of course they will. Some parents will push back. Of course they will. It is still the right decision. And I just, to leaders and teachers in schools that have done the hard and thankless work of doing that, it is a gift to young people, whether they realize it or not.
Yeah.
Sometimes running. Yeah. So, I mean, that's the hard part of being an educator, right? And running schools is you have to, I think one of the challenges of online teaching has been the drama around cameras. I've been deeply unpopular many times in my life, and roundly hated by many people. And one of the times I was most hated was when I tweeted recently that it's a teacher's obligation to do everything they can to get cameras on for students when they're learning. And do teenagers want to turn off their cameras? Of course they do. It's a lot easier to sort of half pay attention and to be checking TikTok and Instagram and doing whatever you want to do if your camera's off. And so of course they fight it. And what is an adult supposed to do? An adult is supposed to realize that if I can see you and you can see me, I can do a lot more things for you educationally, and I can hold you accountable, and I can sustain your attention, and I can see whether you're learning, and you feel tacitly you feel loving accountability. And that's what adults are supposed to do for young people. And so it's hard. It's a really hard thing to ask people to do, but you have to do it anyway. And you have to say, sweetheart, I need to be able to see you during lessons, and I need your camera on.
Yeah. No. I mean, it's
thankless, but it has to be done.
In your book on remote teaching, I think you call this dissolving the screen, don't you?
Yeah.
And so that book, which came out, I think it came out towards the end of the summer. And certainly here in the UK, it was out, and I was aware of it. And then we went into our second phase of lockdown after Christmas, and I bought the team that I work with at my trust a copy of it. We read it together, and we talked to teachers in our schools about it. And it was everywhere. And was that your experience as well, that it kind of went like that?
Yeah, I mean, that was sort of the...
Because you spent the first part of lockdown learning, didn't you, from March to the summer?
Yeah, it was fascinating. You know, we didn't set out to write a book. My team and I, on March 13th, I got back from a trip to Denver, and I thought I'd be on the road the next week, visiting schools and working with schools, and suddenly everything was locked down, and we thought, this thing could last 2 or 3 weeks or two or
Yeah.
3 months,
Yeah.
and we thought, well, let's study as much as we can so we can be helpful to teachers during that period of time. And then suddenly, it became clear, like, we are not going back to school this year. And then it became clear that we were not going to be back to normal in the fall. And we just realized that, thousands and thousands of teachers are going to be asked to do something that's incredibly hard with no training. And they're going to really want practical guidance, and to see there are examples out there of excellence. It's just like the classroom, right? The first thing is to see what it looks like when it's done well. And so, my team basically spent the spring watching as much video as we could and cutting video and trying to get the best that we could at the time into teachers' hands when September rolled around. It's hard because what we've learned since is, and we've learned a lot more, and the workshops that we do are a lot more advanced. But I think we just felt this sense of desperation and urgency. It was stunning when we came back to school in this country in September. It was like, what happened over the summer that so little planning and preparation was done for the realities of what were going to happen when we hit the ground in September. I did trainings with teachers in New York City who, in the middle of September or in October, had never seen a video of anyone else teaching in an online setting, right? They had been doing this for months and they had never seen anyone else do it. So they had nothing to compare themselves to. Just showing them, like, here's a teacher doing 3 things that you could steal and adapt or borrow was like, it wasn't rocket science. It was, it was simple, useful, adaptable tools, but people just hadn't. There was just so little out there. So yes, the book was written in anticipation of a market failure that unfortunately occurred. But I'm happy that it was useful to people, and I'm grateful to people for reading it and hopefully finding useful things in it and adapting them. And obviously what people were able to do with it, then we would see people using the ideas in the book and they were 10 times more brilliant than what we originally wrote. And
Well,
I'm glad there will be no reason.
You don't get to do a 2.0 version.
That's what I was going to say. I'm cautiously optimistic that I will never get the chance to update the book as it deserves to be updated, because hopefully we'll be back to classrooms.
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, Greg, is your outside of education, your great love is sport, and particularly football. And in case you're not clear, that's proper football, not the American kind. And I first became aware of this reading your book Practice Perfect, which is a few years old now, where you talk a lot about what you can learn from sport. And you've recently published almost Teach Like a Champion for football coaches. Would that be a fair description?
Yeah, it's for sport coaches. It's called The Coach's Guide to Teaching, and it's about how do you solve the challenges of of learning in a sport environment.
And what are the differences? What are the big differences between that and the classroom?
Well, I think that's it's rarely acknowledged and talked about with coaches, but it's basically teaching, just in a different setting. The teaching problems are different. One of the key difference, well, a couple of the key differences are in sport. I talk in particular about what I would call group invasion games, which would be football, rugby, basketball. Decisions have to be made as a group. When you're teaching math class, you have to teach each individual to solve equations with 2 variables. On the football pitch, you have to teach 11 players to do that at the same time. And you have to teach people to do things fast, often faster than you can have a conscious thought. And so, I was just lucky to have the opportunity to work with sports federations and professional sports franchises on the side to sort of help them think about teaching. And these were issues that would constantly come up. And I found myself struggling to try to answer them, and would read a lot of cognitive science to try and come up with answers. And I was sort of telling you before we got on the call formally that one of the most fascinating things was that at first I would try to keep this secret from my colleagues in my office. I would like sneak out for the day to go work with the U.S. Soccer Federation because I was embarrassed. Like, schools are the most important institutes in society, and here I was, moonlighting, doing work that I love because I'm passionate about sport. But I couldn't keep it a secret because very quickly I would come back to the office and we'd be watching a video of a teacher and I'd want to tell them the story of what I'd learned, talking to coaches or thinking about coach education. And so the book just wouldn't stay in its lane. So ironically, there are probably some areas that are relevant for educators. One example I think is just the profound importance of perception and the underrated role of perception in decision making. So the first chapter of the coaching book is just about your eyes and how you can't make the right decision reliably, quickly in a game like football unless your eyes are looking at the right thing. And so lots of times we might stop a football player and say, David, what should you do? But a much better question is,
what are you
David,
looking?
what do you see? What are you looking at, right? Because if you're not looking at the right things, you won't perceive that the pass is open or that I should give space in the mid, I should give space in the back line or what have you. Decision making is a profoundly perception-based endeavor. And that is also true in the classroom, interestingly, right? So if I'm coaching a teacher, maybe the first question, instead of what should I do, should be what do you see? What do you notice? Because you can't make the right decisions if you're not noticing the right cues and stimulus in the visual environment. Or sometimes with students, the first question maybe I want to ask about a passage that's complex is what do you see? What do you notice, right? That's a diagnostic question because it tells me what students think is important and whether they're looking at the right things. And if I want to sustainably change the way that they're engaging intellectually in that process, maybe the first thing I have to do is draw their attention to the most important things. And so that process of thinking about the central role of perception to decision making in the sports setting caused me to realize how profound it was, both for developing students, but also for developing teachers.
Right. I mean, that's very interesting. So there's more similarities than differences, perhaps. One of the sort of strangest things to happen to me in recent years was that I've been invited to talk to a couple of rugby clubs to talk to their training staff, and I was contacted and said, look, I don't know where you got my name from, but honestly, I know nothing about rugby. I'm not going to be able to help you. And they interestingly, I've been to two different ones, and they really persist. Well, the first one, you got me in. The second one said, we heard you've been to this other place. We'd like to find out what you told them. But the first place, they were really sure that I'd be able to have some insights that would be helpful for their coaches. And it was really, really interesting talking to them about things from principles from cognitive science, like the differences between novices and experts. I think what you're saying there about noticing that experts see things that novices don't see. And I was able to make some really general points like, sort of about, making predictions for them, things like, well, I imagine your first team players are going to, if you show them a schematic, they're going to see different things than, that your new players, the people who are training. And they were like, yeah, no, that's absolutely right. We just assumed that was some sort of innate quality. And I said, well, I don't think it is. I think it's a result of their experiences. And does that ring true to you, Doug?
100%. So first of all, it rings true to me that I have a total faith in you in whatever setting to deliver absolute value. So I think I'm with the rugby teams. It's a great decision. But I think that this is a point that I talk about with in the book and with sports franchises all the time when I talk to them, is the difference between the way that novices and experts learn. It's misunderstood in the school sector. It's misunderstood in the sporting sector, and people watch the way that elite athletes train, right, and they presume that is the way that novice athletes should train. Just the same way that there's someone always saying, like, if you look at mathematicians' work, they don't they don't memorize multiplication tables. Like, no, of course not, because they're experts already. And so I think that process also happens in schools. But I think one other thing that's fascinating is, in many ways, you can see the elements, the foundations of teaching better when someone presents you with examples outside your domain of expertise, which is you come in as someone who's not a rugby guy and you say, well, let me tell you what it would look like in the classroom, and let me tell you some stories about how it works in schools, and suddenly they can see the forest through the trees very clearly. And I start the coaching book with a story of I got invited to present to this pro license course, which is the coaches of our top national football soccer league get a license every year. And so they invited me to come present to them on teaching, and I had planned to show them a video of a math teacher. And right when they introduced me, I had this just panic attack where I was like, how could I have been so stupid? Like, I'm going to walk up in front of, the 10 elite football coaches in our country and show them video of a math teacher and be like, guys, what do you, how does this help you understand how to, coach your midfield differently? But it was too late to change it, because I was like walking to the front of the room as I had this realization. So I showed them the video just because there was nothing left to do but press play. And their insights were so profound, and they took so much from it because they were sort of set free from watching it through a football lens. Because there have been times when I've shown football coaches video of football coaches. In fact, one time I did this, and it was this example of a coach who I thought he just gave beautiful feedback to his players, and his tone and his specificity. And I stopped the video.
I've seen you tweet videos of this.
Yeah, well, so this was a video. So I showed this to a group of, these are like coaches who led the licensing courses in the US. And so I showed them this video and I said, well, what did you think? And I was expecting to talk about how beautiful his feedback was and the whispered tone and the specificity of it. And they were outraged in the room because he was running an exercise on overlapping outside backs, and he was doing it in the back half of the field instead of the front half of the field. And this was like sacrilege. And I said, oh, great. Well, okay, so ignore that for a minute and let's just talk about the feedback. But they couldn't. They couldn't ignore it. And for 20 minutes, I was just trying to manage the room through being like, okay, if you do this exercise, do it in the front half of the field. And finally, I just gave up. But when I showed the football coaches, sorry?
So, but they could look at the maths teacher and they weren't distracted by, oh, he's got the desks in the wrong shape or any of that crap.
Exactly. Look at that terrible touch. My players are better than his player, right? All that, or like he believes in this and I believe, like all that philosophy and all that was out. And they just looked at the purity of instruction when I showed them the math video, and their analysis was brilliant and profound. And in some ways, I wish that there were 100 teachers in the room. The second guy that I called on, after I showed them this video, who's probably the best American coach and who now coaches in Europe, said, if you want to build relationships, you have to make people better in our job. That the great thing about what this teacher is doing is he's making his students more successful. And people misunderstand relationships in sport, and they think you can just walk around high-fiving players. But unless you can they want to play and they want to be successful. And unless you can make them better, the relationship is ultimately going to be hollow, because in the end, you have to prove that you can teach them, and you have to prove that you can help them succeed. Wow. And so relationships are this iterative process between, like, I care about you. But one of the ways that I care about you is by my making you better and my focusing my teaching on you. And there are so many teachers who say things like, oh, they don't care what you say until they know that they know that you care, and the relationship predates any teaching. And I would just say, like, how can you build a relationship unless you're teaching? Mm-hmm. I think this is the point that the coaches were making, which is you build your relationship by investing in someone and successfully making them better, and that is how they come to believe in you. So it's not as simple as like first you build a relationship and then they trust you. It's like you build their trust by teaching them well. That is where it starts. So the first day of class, start teaching. And teach them really well, and then they will come to trust you. And I think that just became crystal clear to me when I watched that video through the lens of the football coaches.
So it makes sense to me. So one of the insights here, Doug, is that we should show teachers videos of football coaches or someone other than teachers, maybe.
Well, I do think it's fascinating. In Teach Like a Champion 3.0, I'm going to include one video of a football coach. Okay. Interestingly,
controversial.
And I'll tell you what he's doing. If you want to, what's that?
A soccer coach.
Yeah. A soccer coach. But also, I think there's also look, if you're a science teacher, there's power in watching video of science teachers.
Yeah.
But there's also something fascinating about watching an English teacher, or being a year 10 teacher watching a year 2 teacher at work, because I do think that watching things outside your sort of most familiar domain is often very revealing in ways that are unexpected. And so I think video study is really important for teachers, but I think a wide range of the types of videos can be surprisingly fruitful. And oftentimes people will say, oh, that video doesn't apply. In a workshop, we'll say, you have more teachers who teach the same grade level as I do, and we do, and I'll make sure to show you some of your grade level, but you should also be able to take something away from watching a teacher who teaches 6 grade levels below you, because there are also things that are applicable that suddenly you should be able to see in the process of watching them at work.
That's a really interesting idea then, that although domain specificity is really important, that sometimes seeing things outside our domain means we're less distracted by our expectations, perhaps.
I think that's exactly right. And so the ideal training environment would be a portfolio of, things within your domain, but also things outside your domain. And that constant sort of going back and forth, I think is really powerful.
Okay, good lesson.
I mean, I think one, maybe one of the few silver linings of our online teaching world is that we've been asked to do work that is, the fundamentals of teaching are the same, whether you're online or in the classroom. But the setting is different and the context is different, and that has all of a sudden caused us to realize things about teaching that I think we will take back to the classroom from online instruction that we would not have recognized if we hadn't been forced to do this terrible hiatus of Zoom teaching.
Okay.
But the silver lining will be that we'll see things that we wouldn't have seen otherwise.
Yeah. So what are some of those things that you've seen that you might not have seen otherwise?
Well, I think, each teacher will find different things, but a couple things for me, are just the profound importance of attention. The necessity of engaging students' focus and attention and guiding it when they're far from you and when they can be so easily distracted reminds us that attention is perhaps the most important thing in education. Clarity of directions is another thing, like in a classroom, when your directions are unclear, the kids who don't quite understand what you're asking them to do can glance at the other students in the classroom and figure out what they should be doing. But when they're in their kitchen or their bedroom and they're by themselves, they can't do that. And so there's an urgency about clarity of descriptions, and maybe like one of the small things we talk about in our online book is like giving both verbal and visual directions, right? So students can glance at it and see it and go back to it and like find it easily. Is that something we could do better when we go back to the classroom? Yeah, absolutely. I think for sure. Even just the importance of, I think so much of online learning is about students seeing and being seen, and knowing that we see them, that they matter to the endeavor of the classroom, because students often feel invisible online. Is there an analogy that when they come back to the classroom, we can be more intentional about students feeling seen when they're in the classroom and knowing that they're important and central to the endeavor? Are there kids who hide in plain sight in our bricks and mortar classrooms? Absolutely. Are there kids who know they're going to spend the whole day without the teacher engaging them or talking to them or asking them to do anything, and they will wonder whether, or they will believe that the classroom would be perfectly fine and just the same without them? And I just don't think we can let that happen. And maybe seeing the reality of it online has made that a little bit clearer.
So it's not that necessarily that online teaching is that much different. It's that the stakes for getting it wrong are higher.
Yeah, I think they cast certain things into just stark relief, because the stakes for getting it wrong are higher, and the challenge level is higher.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just causes us to focus on different aspects of the interactions that are central to teaching.
Okay, I think that's a really good point. That makes complete sense to me. Before I let you go, Doug, and do tell me when you've got to go, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your the reading curriculum that you're working on. I know, if we hadn't got enough to look forward to from the Lemov canon, there's also you're going to be publishing your reading curriculum, aren't you?
Yeah.
Can you give us a little taste of what might be to come?
Sure. I'm really excited about it. It's been an incredible process, and one of the reasons I believe so much in it is because most of the work has been done by my outstanding colleagues. But I think we've tried to take a couple of ideas that we think are really important and maybe overlooked and operationalize them really carefully. And the first one is we've just tried to build it around books and great books and challenging books, on the idea that reading, that a curriculum should start with excellence and the most important books for young people to read. And then I think one of the barriers to reading those books is background, is the importance of knowledge. And in fact, I made a little list for myself here of the different types of knowledge that we try to think about in our curriculum. I think that where curriculum has gone wrong is that people think of it as a skills-based endeavor.
Right.
Students need to draw inferences when they're reading. Great, so let's practice making inferences. And the notion that I can, if I read Warhorse and make 10 different inferences or 20 different inferences from Warhorse, I will suddenly be able to make inferences about Oliver Twist. I think that's what people believe, that it's a transferable skill that I will learn to be good at inferencing, but that's not actually how that any skill is domain specific. And that the barriers to making inferences about Oliver Twist are knowledge barriers, right? I don't know enough about Victorian society. I don't know about the vocabulary, or I don't have enough experience with the syntax. Yes. So we tried to take the notion that reading is fundamentally a knowledge-driven endeavor,
right,
and operationalize it in the curriculum. And that means technical knowledge, technical vocabulary about things like what is juxtaposition and how does it work, and disciplinary knowledge, which is like I've read lots of books, and I have when I see a scene in a book, it reminds me of other books that I've read.
Yeah.
And background knowledge, which is okay, like let me embed in the course of your reading lots of different short nonfiction passages to inform you about the things that the author probably assumed that you knew something about, or that you might have known something about, that can enrich the book.
Yeah.
So we read, one of the books in the curriculum is The Magician's Nephew, which by C.S. Lewis. It's a great book, fascinating. If you're a kid growing up in 2021 in the United States, you don't really know anything about what it meant to be about British culture, in the early 20th century. And so, what is a boarding school, and how does it work? And
also, you get to find out where a cab comes from, don't you, and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so the cabman, and just like the notion that it would be obvious to a contemporary reader of Lewis that what the way that cabman speaks reveals about his position within class structure.
Right.
Kids don't necessarily pick up on that today, and so you have to give them like a little article on like, okay, here's why he speaks the way that he does, and here's what Lewis probably thought he was implying about him, and there's just so much background knowledge to provide to students, and so the idea behind the curriculum is just they're sort of constantly embedding short nonfiction pieces to even the playing field for students, so they can suddenly be like, oh, now I see what Lewis is doing here. It doesn't actually take away from the analysis; it actually adds to it, because suddenly they have all these sources of knowledge that they can bring to bear in the text. And two other forms of knowledge, I think, are vocabulary is the single most important form of background knowledge, though we don't always think about it as a form of knowledge. And I think we teach it in a way that presumes a vocabulary is a skill when it's a form of knowledge. And then I think there's this thing called syntactical knowledge, which is, it's a lot like vocabulary. You almost have a vocabulary of syntactical forms that you've learned to master in your life. And so complex texts are challenging for students because they don't have enough experience with syntax in which the subject and object are reversed, or in which there are four clauses in the sentence. And so having experience, lots and lots of experience exploring and unpacking and working with complex syntax helps you to be able to read complex text in the same way that having a strong knowledge of different words helps you to do it. And so we set out to just sort of build these 6 pieces of knowledge into our curriculum really intentionally and lovingly, in a way that's fun and playful. Like one of the things we did with vocabulary instruction right away was just try to make it a lot of fun.
Yeah. So the syntactical, that really interests me, because I think for me, one of the things that I've had to unlearn as a teacher of English is that, basically that how we speak and how we write are fundamentally different, and that we, that writing is about trying to make up for the fact that there is no context between me, the speaker, and you, the listener. That I have to supply all of that in what I communicate. Whereas in a spoken text, that we're speaking now, and we can read each other's facial expressions and body language, and I can pause and go, do you know what I mean? And all of that stuff that we take for granted when speaking doesn't exist at the level of writing, and it's a job done by syntax.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful way of describing what I was trying to say about, like, it's a hidden vocabulary to understand the forms of syntax as they try to capture what language does. And so, and I just think it's roundly overlooked. Bruce Sadler, who's an American education writer, calls that syntactic control, your ability to master the forms of syntax to create meaning, both in reading and in writing. And I think, it's a very writing intensive curriculum. And the idea is that, like, intentional writing in much shorter bursts and shorter iterations than we ordinarily assume writing should happen is a really powerful tool to understanding how syntax works. And so is reading in very short focus bursts. So, like, I'll just tell you about a couple of my favorite exercises that I think accomplish this. One of them is called sensitivity analysis. So we might take a sentence from a book that's really challenging and the syntax is nuanced, and maybe we would change one word or one phrase in the sentence and present them to students side by side and say, right, we replaced this word with that word. How is it different now? Or that it's the same words, but we rephrased it. How is the meaning different? Yeah. And what is, how, and there, it's interestingly, it starts with perception. What do you notice about the difference? Great. What does that difference do? What does it mean? One of the other things we do on the writing side is what we call art of the sentence exercises, which is I might ask you to write about a passage, but start with an introduction. Like I might say, respond to the experience of reading the first paragraph of the chapter in one sentence and one sentence only, starting with the phrase "at first glance." Yeah. So first of all, the scarcity of, like, you only have one sentence. You have to get everything in the sentence. It forces you outside your comfort zone. So you can't say, I think boop, I think bop, I think bink. You can't do those sort of wooden, inflexible subject, verb, object sentences. And suddenly I've caused you to write using an introductory prepositional phrase. Yeah. And so now you're developing comfort. Forces complexity, doesn't it? Yes, it forces you to use and wrestle new forms of complexity. And so if I was systematic about giving you lots of examples and different ways of doing that, I would gradually be expanding your syntactic control and your ability to master different forms of syntax.
I think maybe one of the very first ways that we ever connected, Doug, I don't know if you remember this, I think it was back in 2012, and we had a dialogue where I'd read a blog you'd written about the article.
Yes. I remember that. Yeah,
I ripped off it and sort of like, I'm going to try this with my students, and took some ideas and did them, did some of the things that you'd suggested and changed a few things, and it was, for me, it was really, really exciting that I'd been using those kinds of sentence level instructions with more creative, descriptive type of tasks for a while, but doing it with more analytical writing was a revelation for me. I remember you wrote a piece on which I thought was brilliant on I've since discovered it's not actually by the painting is not painted by Bruegel.
It's not.
No, No, it's not. It's not. It's a fake Bruegel. I know.
That's shocking to me.
I know. That it undermines everything that we thought was wrong. If you're interested, there's a brilliant book by a fellow called Toby Ferris, who it's called something like a short introduction to a strange life or something like that. Anyway, he talks about he's obsessed with Bruegel. And he uses Bruegel as a metaphor for life. And he starts with that painting and then sadly says it's not a Bruegel or Bruegel or whatever you say. Anyway, you wrote about that what you were talking about earlier, that idea of saying at first glance, on closer inspection, and that leading people to notice that Icarus isn't obviously configured in the painting. And I'm sure, I don't know if you drew my attention to it, but or something, or somebody else did. But there's an Auden poem, the Beaux-Arts, which makes
right.
just the same kind of exercise. But that kind of, and I know you wrote the foreword, didn't you, for the Writing Revolution, which I found hugely influential. It's a great program, and a wonderful way of looking at writing.
I think maybe it's your phrase, slow reading or slow writing. It's a phrase that you use.
So
right,
yeah. was like one good idea that went viral. Yeah.
I love that. I love that idea, and we use it all the time in the curriculum. We use the Writing Revolution. We use Art of the Sentence. We use sentence expansion exercises. The idea of I think one more quote from.
It's so useful for kids that don't know how to do that, and I think one of the difficulties and I'm sure you find this, one of the difficulties for teachers is that we can do it, and we assume, or the assumptions that we make about what students can't and can do are at the wrong level, and too often I think back to my experience as a teacher that those assumptions were at the level of the paragraph. And maybe they should be at the level of the sentence, and that's certainly something I've learned over the years, very much from you, Doug, which I'm terribly grateful for. And
I feel like I learned a lot of it from you as well, and from Judith Hochman. But I think that just the idea of the sentence, of learning to craft a sentence as a single idea, and to craft an idea that when we want to get rigorous with writing, we tend to assign more of it, but it's actually more rigorous sometimes to assign less of it.
Yeah.
One more quote from Bruce Sadler, who says every sentence is quite literally a composition in miniature. I think I got that from Judith Hochman. But the idea that, like, if a sentence is a composition, it means you can draft it, and then get feedback on it, and then redraft it, and change it and rework it in the same way that you would do with an essay. But you're really, it's like deliberate practice. Suddenly you're learning how to create and craft a single idea, and that's the gap for students, is they don't get a ton of practice creating a nuanced, complex single idea in a single sentence.
Have you read George Saunders' latest book, A Swim in a Pond in the Rain?
I haven't.
Oh, you'll love it, Greg. Doug. Greg. Doug. Yeah, you'll love it. It's fantastic. I mean, you probably know who George Saunders is. Great short story writer. His novel Lincoln in the Bardo, great novel. But he basically, it's a masterclass in how to write through the lens of Russian 19th century Russian literature. And so he takes apart these Chekhov stories, Tolstoy stories, Turgenev stories, and looks at how they work and what we should be noticing. But one of the things I found most inspiring about his message was exactly what you were just saying there, that great writing comes from iteration, from redrafting, from doing over and over and over until we've got each individual sentence exactly as we want it. And there's something quite marvelous about the manageability of working at the level of a sentence, isn't there?
And the time is not irrelevant, right? When most of the time when students rework things, they write an essay for us or a paragraph for us, and they turn it in, and it sits on our desk for several weeks because it takes so long to grade. And then we give them feedback, at which point they no longer care, or the moment's gone. yeah, but if they write a sentence and I can say, great, rewrite it to do this. Now try it this way. I can make it a series of playful, fun exercises, or I can have them rewrite it multiple times. But it becomes like a live, iterative process.
Yeah.
And this has been I think one of the blessings I've had in life is that my mother was an editor when I was growing up, and so this is what learning to write a paper was like for me. I remember I was maybe 12 and I wrote a book report, and I said, the book is interesting. And she said, you can't say the book is interesting. In what way is it interesting? Like, let's focus on that word. And we spent 15 minutes thinking about, like, what is the phrase to capture the way in which this book is interesting. I mean, I must have rewritten that sentence
specificity. That's the key.
Yes.
Yeah.
To capture what you wanted to, to not choose a word that vaguely captures some of what you're trying to say, but the exact word or the exact phrase. And then, like, where do and so now I subject my own children to that, right? Like, we go through their papers and I say, great, find 5 verbs that you can make active and dynamic instead of passive. Just improve the quality of your verbs. Strike out all your adjectives, and like improve the quality of your verbs. With the idea of like making meaning through word choice and syntactic design is
and morphology.
I think that's how you learn to think, right? Like, they don't realize that the idea is vague until they're forced to rewrite it. And that's why I think writing is such a profound part of thinking.
That's really interesting. I mean, I often joke that I don't know what I think until I write it down. But there's something in that deliberative, poised consideration about how is another human being that I can't see or hear, how are they going to understand what I'm trying to communicate? There's something quite profound about that act of putting the idea into the void and hoping it comes back, isn't there?
Yeah. And so that's both from a reading and writing perspective, I think it's a lot of what we're trying to capture in our approach in this curriculum was to make exercises like that just a daily thing that students were constantly doing. How can I capture my idea more carefully? Constantly rewriting very small pieces of writing. And how can I be attentive to the word choices and syntactical choices that authors are making and how they create meaning for me?
There's my favorite 3 questions. And I got this from David Crystal, who's you know who David Crystal is. So 3 questions. Firstly, 1, what was the choice that was made? 2, what other choices were available? And 3, what's the effect of the choices? Those 3 questions, I think, get to the real heart of language instruction.
Yeah, because because the level of intentionality and focus is so high.
And specificity,
Yeah, absolutely agree. So hopefully, and I just think that it's so easy to let language kind of operate at a superficial level, and maybe that's what we're trying to do when we're teaching English is to strip that superficiality from language and to be more intentional about the ways we're thinking.
I think so. It's that there's that naive understanding that students have because they're thinking of writing as being a bit like speech. And you say to them, why do you think the writer did this? And they say, probably couldn't think of anything else. And,
exactly.
And it makes complete sense from their perspective. But when they understand that writing is an attempt to manipulate a reader that they will never meet, I think it really fundamentally changes them, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it's interesting because it goes back to this idea of perception, which is you can only what were the choices that were available, right? That's almost a perception question. It's like what your conception of the choices that are available is much richer and wider than their conception of the choices that were available to the writer. It's one of the reasons why I love the idea of just like, well, here is a choice that they might have made. Now, what do you see? Like, how are they different? Which is that for a student who might struggle to imagine the different choices, it actually makes it immensely concrete.
Yes. No, exactly right. Listen, Greg, I could continue. Well, I don't know why I'm calling you Greg. I'm apologising reservedly, Doug.
Okay. Do you know that 99 times out of 100, when someone calls me the wrong name, it's always Greg? I must be like a spiritual. I must be a spiritual Greg or something. I had a colleague who called me Greg for years out of school.
Really? I'm embarrassed. But Doug, I could continue geeking out with you about language and reading and writing for, well, probably at tedious length. But I'm going to let you go because obviously you've got work to do and all the rest of it. But it's been an absolute joy to talk to you. And I'm really looking forward to seeing more about your reading curriculum when it's available. But Doug Lemov, thank you ever so much for allowing us to waste your time this afternoon. Thank you.
David, thanks. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it at least as much as you did. So let's do it again soon.